Welcome back. This is your first day of Unit 6, which is all about reproduction. So this unit's broken down into 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about asexual reproduction. Then we'll move on to sexual reproduction until we finally get to human reproduction and what that looks like. Okay, but today is our first day, so we will be talking about asexual reproduction and how does it work? But before we get into that, you guys have got a do now question. So go ahead and pause this video, answer your do now, and press play when you're ready to review it. Okay. So why do you think you are no longer the size you were when you were 5? What happens? What happened? Well, this is all due to something called cell growth and division. Okay, and we'll be talking about cell division a lot in this unit, but we need to know that cell division is what allows us to create new and more cells. Okay, so I'm going to put more new cells. Okay, so we will be talking more about cell growth and division in the upcoming days, but today I want us to focus on what exactly is asexual reproduction. Okay, well, we've learned that if we see the letter A or an in front of a word, that means without. So with asexual reproduction, that means that organisms are able to produce offspring without sexual reproduction. Okay, but what exactly does that look like? Well, we need to know that asexual reproduction is reproduction with only one parent. So humans do not reproduce asexually. Asexual reproduction requires only one parent. But what does that look like? Well, it means that offspring are going to be genetically identical to the parent because that parent is passing on the identical genetic information to its offspring. There is no genetic variation. This also means that there is no sperm or egg involved, right? I just told you that humans do not reproduce asexually. Dogs don't reproduce asexually. Cats don't reproduce asexually because there is no sperm or egg involved. But there are many organisms that do reproduce asexually. And today we're going to learn about a few of those organisms as well as some different types of asexual reproduction. So the first type of asexual reproduction we need to know is something called binary fission. And that is when the parent cell is going to divide into 2 equal parts. Okay, and some examples of organisms that undergo this are bacteria, paramecium, euglena, and amoeba, all reproduce through binary fission. And this is what that looks like, where one cell is going to elongate or get longer and then pinch off in the middle to divide into 2 equal cells. Notice that these 2 cells are the same exact size because with binary fission, those cells are dividing into equal parts. Okay. Here is another picture of what that looks like. So this one cell is going to divide eventually into 2, but I want us to look specifically at step number 2 here. We see that in order for this to happen, in order for binary fission to happen, the nucleus has to duplicate. Okay, and why does this need to happen? Well, it needs to happen so that both cells have the same genetic information. Okay, and so eventually when we reach step 6 down here, those 2 cells have divided or pinched off into 2 equal cells that have the same genetic information. Okay, but then there's another type of asexual reproduction called budding. And this is similar to binary fission, except for the biggest difference is that the parent is going to divide into 2 unequal parts. Okay, and 2 examples of organisms that use this are yeast and hydra. So here's an example of what budding looks like. Okay, this is going to be one cell, and this is the second. Eventually, that bud, this tiny cell right here, is going to pinch off and is going to be another cell. But you can see that they're not the same size. They're dividing into 2 unequal parts. Here's another picture of what that looks like. This one cell is going to form this bud, which eventually pinches off and forms a new cell. But they're unequal sizes. They're not the same size. But one similarity we do see with binary fission and budding is that, again, the nucleus has to duplicate. So both of these cells, even though they're different sizes, they have the same genetic information. So, oh, go back. So they are still genetically identical, even though their size is a little bit different. All right, the third type of asexual reproduction is something called sporulation. Now, this is the process by which something called spores are released by the parent. Those spores germinate and then grow to form new organisms. And you might be pretty familiar with this because this is how mold spreads, as well as mushrooms reproducing. So if you are anything like me, okay, and you've gone into the kitchen to make yourself a sandwich, and then the unthinkable happens, okay? You see that there is mold on your bread, but you really want that sandwich, right? And so what do? You just tear off that piece of bread that has mold on it, you eat your sandwich, and you continue on with your day, okay? I'm actually here to tell you, don't be like me. Don't do that. Because if you see in this picture, when mold is present on your bread, mold is already entirely spread throughout that piece of bread. Because although you might just see black or green or brown spots on one part of your bread, that mold has actually already spread roots throughout that entire piece of bread. Did I just say the bread? The mold has already spread roots called rhizoids throughout that entire piece of bread. Okay, and those roots are going to sprout up things called sporangium. This is not important, but all you need to know is that those sporangium are going to produce spores, which are those tiny little microscopic structures that actually spread mold all over that bread. So although you only see the mold present on one part, that fungus is already spread throughout the entire piece. So don't do it. Don't just tear the mold off, just throw it away. Don't eat it. You can thank me later. On a more positive note, another type of asexual reproduction is something called vegetative propagation. So if you are into gardening, you might be pretty familiar with this concept. This is the process where a new plant is produced from a portion of another plant. And there are 3 examples of this. There's something called grafting, cutting, and runners. I'm going to show you pictures of what each of those look like. But if you have ever bought a plant from the store, this is how it's made. So they have one mother or parent plant. A section is then cut off of it. They repot that cut off section, and then they sell it to you because that plant or that cutting is going to generate a new plant. Okay, here's another example of what that looks like. Again, if you just cut off a stem or a branch from a plant and then repot it either in water or in soil, eventually it's going to grow and it's going to produce a new and bigger plant. Okay. Another example of vegetative propagation is something called grafting. And this is where 2 sections of a plant can actually be combined. So this happens if a plant is damaged or needs to just be combined for whatever reason. You can take a section of 2 different plants, combine them together like you see in this picture right here, and then bind them really tight with some sort of wrap. Basically wrap it up in a bandage like it's a mummy. And eventually, after you wrap that plant, over time, it's going to grow and those plants are going to combine into one structure. So this is an example of grafting here where these 2 twigs or stems were placed into the base of a tree, and eventually over time they combined because that grafting essentially causes the, how can I explain this? Causes the plants to, I've said it a million times, but combine into one structure. Okay. And the last type of vegetative propagation we need to know is something called runners. This is one example of how some plants reproduce. For example, strawberries reproduce this way. They essentially form these horizontal roots that run along the ground, and then multiple plants are going to pop up alongside those runners. So you can see that here. These are technically different plants that are sprouting from just one runner. So this is an example of mint. These are strawberries down here. And this is just another example of how those plants reproduce. But again, it is asexual reproduction because it's just one parent producing all of those separate plants. All right. And the last example of asexual reproduction we need to know is one of my favorites. It's called regeneration. Now, this is super, super cool. This is when this is the development of an entirely new organism from a part of an original organism. So there are a few examples of organisms that do this, like starfish, earthworms, planaria. Basically, if you cut the arm off of a starfish or if you cut an earthworm in half, you're not killing it. In fact, you're actually helping it regenerate and helping it grow a new organism. That starfish, its arm is going to create an entirely new starfish. It's so cool. So here's an example of that. Actually, I like the second picture better. You can see that if we cut this planaria into different chunks, if we cut it into thirds, it's going to regenerate entirely new organisms from those chunks that you've cut off. The same thing happens in earthworms. If you cut that earthworm in half, you've actually just created 2 earthworms. Now, humans can't regenerate entirely new organisms, right? If I cut off my arm, there's not going to be 2 Miss Collinses that grow, but we do have a separate form of regeneration in our body. We can actually regenerate new organs. Okay. But I'm not going to tell you what organs can do this because I want you to think about it. There's one example of regeneration in humans that you've probably seen in your everyday life, and then there's one that you probably haven't seen but may have heard of. I want you to think about that. What is that example of regeneration in humans that's happening in you maybe right now? I'm not going to tell you again, but I want you to send me a message on Remind if you can figure out what it is. What type of regeneration do we undergo? Okay, now that is all that you need to know for today's lesson. So go ahead and pause this video, complete your exit ticket, and submit both your exit ticket and your notes before tomorrow morning at 8:30. Have a wonderful afternoon, and I will see you guys soon.